Truth, leave amen.
Oh my God. Stay with me. What can you tell us about what happened here?
It was my home.
Just tell us what happened and maybe we can help you.
I can't tell you something I don't know.
Truth, leave amen. Morning came to Larkspur Hollow as if it had been washed clean during the night. The sky over northern Vermont was a pale, glassy blue, thin as china, and the pine trees along Morning Glass Lake still carried small white seams of melting snow on their branches. The lake itself held the whole world upside down: the clouds, the steeple of the white church, the dark line of the forest, and the wounded shape of Marlowe Bennett's lakeside house at the far end of the road. What had once been a handsome cedar home with green shutters now stood partly open to the morning. Its roof bowed, its windows dark, its porch wrapped in yellow tape. A faint gray mist lifted from the place where heat still slept beneath the boards. It did not roar anymore. It only breathed, and somehow that was worse. Jessica Ward stepped out of the black government SUV and stood still for a moment, letting the scene speak before anyone else did. She was 27, with a slim athletic build, calm blue-gray eyes, and chestnut-brown hair pulled low at the back of her neck. She wore a dark navy FBI jacket over a gray shirt, black field pants, and boots that had seen enough winter roads to stop looking new. Jessica had learned early that a scene always told the truth first, before grief, before fear, before money, before lawyers. The problem was that people hurried in afterward and began laying blankets over it. Beside her, Rin jumped down from the back of the SUV with a soft thud. He was a 2-year-old German Shepherd, K9, sable, coated, lean, bright-eyed, still young enough to look curious about the world, and old enough to know the world sometimes lied. His ears stood like twin watchtowers. His tail did not wag. Rin lowered his nose toward the cold ground, drew in the morning, and looked toward the house. A local deputy named Miles Garner met them near the tape. He was a square-shouldered man in his late 40s, with wind-reddened cheeks, a trimmed sandy mustache, and the tired kindness of someone who had spent years delivering news nobody wanted. "Agent Ward," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Glad you made it." His eyes moved to Rin, then softened a little. "That the young one?" Jessica almost smiled. "Young does not mean careless." Deputy Garner gave a small nod, the kind men gave when they were not ready to agree, but did not want to argue with a working dog behind him. 2 ATF fire investigators moved carefully through the remaining structure. They were not rushing. Good investigators never did. A rushed scene became a confused scene, and confusion was where dishonest people liked to hide. Marlowe Bennett stood near the edge of the driveway, speaking to a woman from a local news station. He was 56, broad through the chest, with a neatly shaped silver beard, pale skin, and expensive wool gloves folded in one hand, as if even sorrow had manners. His coat was dark brown and costly, his boots polished despite the wet gravel. Larkspur Hollow knew him as a generous man, the kind who gave to the church roof fund, sponsored the winter coat drive, and remembered widows at Christmas. He spoke softly to the reporter, his voice lowered into the tender register of a man describing loss. "It was the old heating system," he said. "I should have replaced it last year." He paused at exactly the right place. "You always think you have more time." Jessica watched his face. Not because grief had to look a certain way, but because rehearsed grief often arrived too neatly dressed. This case should have belonged to the town. Maybe the county, maybe the insurance investigators, one house, one fire, one claim. But Bennett's insurance paperwork had traveled through federal channels. Several invoices had been submitted electronically from out-of-state vendors, and the name of one independent adjuster had appeared in 2 other fire claims across northern counties. That was how ATF came for the burn patterns, and how the FBI came for the money, the statements, and the shape of a possible network. Jessica was not there to take over the fire. She was there to listen to the lies that might grow out of it. A second SUV rolled in behind her, and Ethan Cole stepped out, closing the door without sound. He was 35, tall, broad-shouldered, with short dark brown hair, light stubble along a sharp jaw, and the quiet posture of a man who had once measured rooms by exits and danger. A former Navy SEAL newly transferred into federal investigative work, Ethan carried himself without show. His charcoal field jacket was plain, his boots worn, his eyes steady. He did not greet the house with surprise. He looked first at the tree line, the rear drive, the side door, the slope down toward the lake. Jessica noticed. Most people looked at damage. Ethan looked at departure. "Morning," he said. "Cold one," Jessica replied. "House like this," Ethan said, studying the cedar frame. "If the heater starts it, the story should move one way. This one feels like it tried to walk in two directions." Jessica glanced at him. That was not the language of a rookie. That was the language of someone who had learned to distrust easy paths. Rin stepped toward Ethan, stopped in front of him, and looked up. Ethan did not reach for him. He simply lowered his chin and said, "You are a little young to look that disappointed in people." Rin blinked once, solemn as a church elder. Deputy Garner gave a quiet cough that might have been a laugh. Inside the house the air had cooled, but the smell remained layered in the walls. Wet wood, old smoke, melted insulation, and something sharper beneath it, faint enough that a person might dismiss it if he wanted the morning to stay simple. Jessica moved slowly through what had been the living room. The space was not large, yet the preliminary insurance list claimed antique armchairs, framed paintings, a crystal set, a clock collection, carved side tables, imported rugs, and enough family heirlooms to make the room sound less like a home and more like a museum that had misplaced its marble pillars. Jessica did not say that aloud. She wrote a note instead. Small room, large memory. A thin crack sounded from the hallway. One sharp snap of cooling wood in the silence, and every person in the house stopped breathing for half a second. Rin lifted his head. Ethan's hand moved toward empty air where instinct remembered a weapon he no longer carried. Jessica felt the pause settle over them, bright and cold. Then Rin turned. Not toward the blackened living room everyone had been studying, but toward the narrow side hall no one had cared about yet. He walked with his nose low, not pulling, not rushing. Rin was not trained as the ATF's primary accelerant dog, and Jessica would never pretend he could replace a lab. But he knew certain odors, knew touched objects, knew when a scent trail did not belong to the story being told. At the end of the side hall, he stopped before a patch of scorched floor that looked ordinary at first glance. Then he sat. His ears stood forward. His eyes moved from Jessica to the wall. On the wall hung a horseshoe, blackened at the edges, mounted crookedly on a surviving strip of pine paneling. It looked like one of those sentimental country objects people kept because their father had kept it, and his father before him. But when Jessica leaned closer, she saw the screws holding it were bright beneath the soot, newer than the wood around them. The holes were clean, too clean. Someone had hung that horseshoe not long before the fire, as if placing a memory where a memory was needed. Ethan crouched beside her. "That's supposed to be old, supposed to be?" Jessica said. "Is it?" Jessica looked toward the driveway, where Marlo Bennett was now dabbing at one eye with a folded handkerchief, while the reporter lowered her microphone with great sympathy. Not old enough to have earned the story. Outside, an ATF investigator named Dana Ruiz joined them. She was a compact woman in her early 40s, with black hair tucked under a navy cap, brown skin warmed by years outdoors, and eyes that seemed built for patient disbelief. She told them the early patterns did not fit one clean start from a faulty heating system. "Could still be explainable," Dana said, careful, as professionals are careful, "but I do not like how this hallway reads." Jessica appreciated that. Said that. Honest investigators did not force certainty. They made room for truth to arrive. Ethan scanned the first insurance summary on his tablet. He is claiming a lot for this footprint. His thumb moved down the screen. Metal clocks, crystal 7 upholstered chairs in the front room. Jessica looked back at the narrow living room. 7 chairs? Unless 2 were stacked on the piano he also says was here? There was no piano mark on the floor? No, Ethan said. There was not. Jessica wrote another note. A small house cannot carry the memory of a museum, not unless someone is building the museum after the fire. She felt the case shift beneath her feet. A sad accident had begun turning into something colder, something with receipts and timing and practiced voices. In her experience, greed did not always arrive wearing a grin. Sometimes it arrived carrying a handkerchief, speaking gently, and thanking everyone for their kindness. Rin stepped back into the hallway and placed one front paw on the cold ash near the strange patch of floor. Then he turned his head, slowly, toward Marlowe Bennett. The man was still outside, still speaking softly, still framed by the lake's pale morning light like a grieving neighbor in a church painting. Jessica followed Rin's gaze. For one quiet second, she understood that her young K-9 was not simply studying the place that had burned. He was studying the man who had been allowed to explain it. By noon, the fire beside Morning Glass Lake had stopped looking like a tragedy and started looking like a question. Jessica Ward had learned to respect that change. Tragedy asked people to comfort one another. A question asked them to choose their words carefully. The temporary interview room had been set up inside Larkspur Hollow's old town hall, a white clapboard building with green trim, tall windows and floors that creaked like they remembered every argument ever held above them. Outside, the lake road glittered with thawing snow. Inside, the room smelled of old paper, coffee, wool coats, and the faint lemon polish someone had rubbed into the long oak table that morning, as if cleanliness could make truth feel more welcome. Jessica sat near one end of the table with Rin stretched beneath her chair. The 2-year-old German shepherd looked almost too young for the solemn work, his sable coat clean against the dull floorboards, his ears rising and lowering with each new sound in the hallway. But his youth had a strange grace to it. Rin did not yet carry the heavy pride of older working dogs. He carried curiosity, and curiosity, Jessica had found, could be a lantern in rooms where people had closed all the windows. Ethan Cole stood near the wall with his arms folded, his dark field jacket still carrying the smell of cold air from the lake. The former Navy SEAL did not fill silence by habit. He let it work. That was one of the first things Jessica liked about him, though she had no intention of saying so. Some people needed to prove they were useful. Ethan simply noticed what needed noticing. Across the table sat Evelyn Hart, the insurance attorney assigned to conduct the examination under oath. She was in her early 50s, tall and narrow, with silver blonde hair cut to her jawline and clear green eyes behind rimless glasses. Her voice was polite, but it had the careful edge of a paper knife. She had spent 20 years listening to people describe losses, and somewhere along the way she had learned that grief and greed could wear the same black coat. Beside her, a court reporter named Maeve Collins adjusted her small recording device. Maeve was a round-faced woman in her 30s, with dark curls pinned up in a practical knot in fingers that moved over the stenotype machine as lightly as a pianist touching a hymn. She smiled at everyone once, then disappeared into her work. "This is not a criminal interrogation," Evelyn said quietly before the first witness came in, "but every statement is recorded, sworn and signed." Jessica nodded. A lie told in a parking lot can be called confusion. A lie told here begins to build its own cage. Ethan looked at her. "You always this cheerful before lunch. Only when paperwork behaves like a witness." He gave the smallest smile, barely enough to disturb his expression. Rin lifted his head, as if checking whether that counted as humor. Marlowe Bennett entered first. In daylight, without the reporter's microphone in front of him, he looked less like a grieving neighbor and more like a man aware of how grief was supposed to sit in a chair. He wore a charcoal coat over a pressed blue shirt, his silver beard trimmed close, his pale hands folded neatly on the table. There was nothing messy about him. Even the redness around his eyes seemed placed there with care. He answered Evelyn's questions in a low, steady voice. He said he had left the house at 5:40 p.m. to attend a charity dinner in Montpelier. He said the heating system had been unreliable for months. He said the house contained family pieces collected across generations: clocks, crystal, paintings, rugs, heirloom chairs, and a piano his mother had loved. When he spoke of the piano, he lowered his gaze. Jessica looked at the floor plan in front of her. The room where the piano supposedly stood had no floor marks, no burned shadow, no space that made sense. Next came Clara Voss, Marlowe's younger sister. She was 52, tall and thin as a winter birch, with dyed auburn hair swept into a loose twist and a silk scarf knotted too tightly at her throat. Her skin had the pale, powdered look of someone who disliked mirrors but needed them. Clara spoke warmly of her brother, yet her fingers worried the edge of her sleeve until the fabric curled. She confirmed she had spoken with Marlowe at 6:05 p.m. and heard traffic in the background. He sounded tired, she said, but he was nowhere near the lake house. The phrase came out smoothly, almost polished. Jessica wrote it down exactly as Clara said it. Nowhere near. People who told the truth often gave places. People who rehearsed often gave distances. A sudden burst of static snapped from the recorder, sharp as ice cracking across a pond, and Clara stopped mid-breath. For one suspended second, the whole room listened to that little machine hiss in the middle of her sentence. Rin rose halfway from beneath Jessica's chair. Eyes fixed not on Clara's face, but on the scarf at her throat, where her pulse had begun to beat visibly against silk. Then the static faded, and Clara smiled too quickly, as if the room had not just heard her fear before her mouth could hide it. After Clara, Nolan Pike arrived with a leather case in one hand and the expression of a man who considered manners a form of armor. He was 48, medium height, smooth, cheeked except for a narrow gray mustache, with dark hair combed back from a high forehead and brown eyes that rarely stayed still. His suit was modest but perfect. His shoes shone. He greeted Evelyn by name, nodded to Jessica, nodded to Ethan, and glanced at Rin with cheerful caution. Nolan was an independent insurance adjuster, the kind of man homeowners trusted because he sounded like a bridge between disaster and payment. He explained that Marlowe's policy had been upgraded 11 days before the fire due to updated household valuation. He said the timing was unfortunate, but not suspicious. He said invoices had been submitted properly. He said the property list was extensive because the Bennett family had old Vermont roots. When Nolan set his leather case beside the chair, Rin stood, not fast, not dramatically. He simply rose, walked to the case, and sat in front of it, nose lowered but not touching. Nolan laughed softly. "I hope he does not think I brought him lunch." Ethan looked at the case. "Depends what you keep in there." "Documents, mostly. Then he may be disappointed." Nolan chuckled, but the sound did not reach the corners of his eyes. Jessica noticed. So did Rin, though Rin had the courtesy not to mention it. The fourth interview belonged to Drew Larkin, the heating repairman. Drew was 61, broad in the shoulders but bent slightly at the neck from years of ducking into basements, with thick gray hair, a weather-lined face, and hands roughened by tools and winter work. He wore a brown canvas jacket and smelled faintly of metal, wood stove smoke, and peppermint lozenges. People in Larkspur Hollow trusted Drew. He fixed furnaces for widows before storms, cleared church steps without being asked, and never charged full price to families who paid in jars of jam and apology. He spoke slowly, with a tired gentleness that made him easy to believe. The Bennett heating system, he said, had been aging badly. A fire was not impossible. "Old houses," he murmured, looking down at his hands. "They remember every repair you did not make." Jessica almost liked him for that sentence, almost. But then he described the heater's weakness with too much certainty for a man who claimed he had only done a brief inspection weeks earlier. Ethan shifted near the wall, that was all. One boot moved half an inch. Jessica saw it and knew he had heard the same thing. Last came Hazel Whitcomb, Marlowe's nearest neighbor. Hazel was 79, short, soft around the middle, with white hair tucked under a knitted blue cap and cheeks pink from the cold. She carried a cloth purse covered in embroidered robins and apologized to the room before sitting down, though no one had accused her of anything. Unlike the others, Hazel did not try to sound certain. She said she heard a car on the lake road sometime before the fire. Maybe one car, maybe two. She saw no face. She saw a dim shape near the Bennett drive, but the evening had been turning blue and her kitchen window liked to blur when the heat came on. "At my age," she said, patting her purse. "My ears sometimes tell stories my eyes refuse to confirm." Rin, who had remained watchful all morning, softened when Hazel spoke. He lowered his head onto his paws, and the old woman's eyes filled suddenly. "That dog believes me," she whispered. Jessica answered gently. "He believes you are trying." By late afternoon, the town hall windows had turned gold. The interviews lay across the table in neat folders, and neatness was beginning to bother Jessica. Marlowe left at 5:40. Clara called at 6:05. Nolan upgraded the claim by procedure. Drew explained the heater. Each piece fit, but too smoothly, like a puzzle cut by the same hand. Outside, Deputy Garner brought in the first report on road cameras. One camera near the lake road had gone dark for 17 minutes. Another showed headlights, but no readable plate. Phone records were not final, but the early tower data suggested Clara's call had not traveled the way she described. It did not place anyone inside the Bennett house. Jessica would not let it do more work than it could. But it did one important thing. It wounded the claim that everyone had been far away. Ethan leaned over the property list again. Metal clocks, crystal pieces, 7 antique chairs, imported rugs, oil paintings, and a piano. Jessica looked at him. The piano bothers you. The missing floor marks bother me. The 7 chairs bother physics. And the crystal? If it existed, something should remain. Jessica placed Marlowe's recorded statement into the player. His voice returned to the room, soft and sorrowful. I did not go back to the house after 5 o'clock. I never saw it again until the firefighters called me. Ryn rose before the sentence ended. He walked across the room to the evidence hooks by the door, where Marlowe's smoke-touched coat hung in a clear garment sleeve. Jessica followed. Ryn did not paw at it wildly. He only sat beneath it and looked up. Evelyn opened the sleeve with gloved hands. Inside one pocket, folded twice, was a receipt from a farm supply store. Leather gloves, industrial cleaner, purchased the afternoon before the fire. Jessica carried the receipt back to the table and placed it beside Marlowe's signed statement. No one spoke. Even the old building seemed to hold its breath. Through the window, Morning Glass Lake caught the last light and turned silver, bright and cold as a blade laid flat. Marlowe Bennett had told them he never went back after 5. The paper on the table did not call him a liar yet. It simply waited, patient as winter, for him to explain why the first small flame in his story had begun on a printed receipt. By the second Monday, the fire beside Morning Glass Lake no longer stood alone. It had begun gathering shadows around it. Jessica Ward saw the pattern first in the paperwork, because paperwork, when frightened, tended to repeat itself. 3 older claims from northern Vermont had the same odd shape, electronic invoices from vendors in different states, the same misspelled word in the description of antique furnishings, the same temporary rental form, with language too polished for ordinary people in distress, and the same quiet name listed near the bottom of each file, Nolan Pike, independent adjuster. 1 mistake could be coincidence, 2 could be habit. 4 began to sound like a hymn sung by people who did not believe in the words. The temporary office in Town Hall had turned into a map of small sins. Jessica pinned claim summaries beside phone records, road camera stills, insurance upgrades, and photographs from the burned Bennett house. Ethan Cole stood beside the board with a cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. The former Navy SEAL had a stillness that could make a room feel measured. He did not pace. He watched. His dark eyes moved from Nolan's name to Drew Larkin's repair receipts, then to a route map running out of Larkspur Hollow toward the Pines. The same service road shows up twice, he said, behind Drew's furnace shop. Jessica followed his finger. A narrow lane bent behind Drew Larkin's workshop, then disappeared into timber before reaching an abandoned maple mill. Could be storage, she said. Could be nothing. Ethan looked toward Ryn, who lay near the door with his sable head resting on his paw. He does not look like he believes in nothing. Ryn lifted one ear, as if accepting the compliment with the dignity of a young king pretending not to enjoy praise. The 2-year-old German shepherd had not forgotten Nolan's leather case. Twice that morning, when Jessica passed the evidence table, Ryn had stopped near the plastic sleeve that held a swab from the case handle. It was not enough for proof. It was enough for direction. Jessica called Deputy Miles Garner and requested local backup near the old furnace shop. She made it clear they were only checking a lead, not conducting a raid. Garner, practical and cautious, said he would send a unit from the North Road, though a fast-moving snow squall was already blowing down from the hills. "Roads may get slick for a spell," he warned. Jessica thanked him and looked out the window. The sky had darkened with the sudden moods of northern spring, when sunlight could turn to white weather before a person finished a sentence. Drew Larkin's furnace shop sat at the edge of town, a low metal building with a hand-painted sign and a row of old heating units lined up along the fence, like tired soldiers waiting for one more winter. Behind it stood a smaller storage building, half wood, half corrugated steel, with a roof bowed under old snow. Past that, the pines thickened around the service lane that led toward the abandoned maple mill. The place smelled of wet bark, cold metal, and something sharper tucked beneath it. Rin stepped from the SUV and immediately went still. His nose lowered. His shoulders tightened. Then he moved toward the back door of the storage building without pulling, without noise, but with the kind of certainty that made Jessica's skin prickle. "Backup is still 12 minutes out," Ethan said, listening to the radio crackle. "We look. We do not get heroic," Jessica replied. That was almost a speaker. It was a warning. They entered through the rear, where the lock had been opened recently, not forced. Inside, the storage room was dim and crowded with old furnace parts, rolled insulation, paint cans, toolboxes, and tarps stiff with dust. A single work light burned near the far wall. Under it, a tall, narrow man was kneeling before a steel safe, working fast with a pry tool and a small electric drill. He was 42, with a long, bony face, close cropped black hair, pale eyes that looked more gray than blue, and a beard shaved down to dark stubble along a hard jaw. His clothes were plain, canvas jacket, work pants, gloves, but his movements were not those of a surprised handyman. They were clean, practiced, and economical. This was Caleb Rusk, though Jessica knew his name only from a half-buried note in an old claim file: contract cleanup, paid cash. Rin blocked the rear exit before Caleb could run. The man turned, saw the dog, and lost half a second. Ethan used that half-second. He crossed the room with controlled speed, took Caleb down against a stack of rolled tarps, and had one wrist secured before the drill stopped spinning on the floor. Caleb did not plead. He did not curse. He looked at Jessica with an expression so flat it felt almost restful. That frightened her more than panic would have. Panic belonged to people caught by surprise. Caleb looked like a man whose bad day had merely started earlier than expected. Jessica read him his rights, her voice calm, the recorder in her pocket already running. Ethan secured Caleb to a wall, mounted metal anchor ring in a small side room, while Jessica checked the safe. The anchor looked old but solid, bolted into a timber stud beside a rusted radiator pipe. Caleb sat on the floor, one wrist cuffed to the ring, his free hand visible. Rin remained at the doorway, watching him with a low, silent focus. The safe was not open yet, but through the drilled gap Jessica could see paper edges, a phone charger, and the corner of a small black notebook. If this was what Caleb had returned for, then the safe was no side detail. It was the heart inside the ribs. The work light flickered once, and somewhere inside the wall came a tiny electric buzz, thin as a trapped wasp. Everyone froze. Rin's head snapped toward the ceiling. Caleb smiled for the first time, just a small bend at one corner of his mouth, and the room suddenly felt less like storage and more like a clock that had begun counting down. Ethan moved to the wall, studying the old wiring and the containers stacked nearby. "Could be nothing," he said. Jessica looked at the solvents on the shelf, the loose cords, the safe, and Caleb's smile. "We are done believing in nothing." The radio signal inside the building broke into static. Jessica stepped just outside the rear door to call Garner again and retrieve a seal kit from the SUV, because whatever was inside that safe had to be preserved properly. She was gone less than a minute. In that minute, Caleb began to breathe differently. Ethan noticed. Caleb winced and shifted his cuffed wrist. "Too tight," he said. His voice was low, dry, almost bored. Ethan did not step close at first. He angled to the side, careful, keeping distance. Caleb slid off the crate, as if his leg had cramped and dropped hard to the floor. The anchor ring jerked, once, twice. Ethan saw the wood flex behind it, and understood too late that the wall had been prepared. Caleb had known this room. He had known the timber behind the panel had been cut weak and hidden with a narrow strip of board. When he threw his full weight sideways, the anchor tore free, taking a short length of metal bracket with it. He was still cuffed. He had not escaped the restraint, but now the restraint had become weight in his hand. Jessica heard the heavy sound from outside and turned. At the same instant, Caleb shouted, "The dog is near the trigger wire." Ethan looked toward the doorway by instinct, toward Rin, toward Jessica's shadow in the snow, bright opening. It was only half a heartbeat, but half a heartbeat was sometimes the cruelest measure in the world. Caleb swung the metal bracket upward in the tight space. Ethan caught part of the motion with his shoulder, stumbled on the wet floor where snow had melted from their boots, and fell against the steel worktable with a sound Jessica would remember long after the case was closed. She rushed in as Caleb bolted through the opposite door, dragging the broken bracket at his cuffed wrist. Rin sprang after him, then stopped so sharply his claws scratched the floor. Ethan lay near the table, one arm bent beneath him, his face drained of color, his breath shallow and uneven. For one terrible second, Jessica saw two roads open before her, one through the back exit, after a known fugitive, and one down to the floor beside a man who might not have minutes to spare. "Rin, stay," she said, though the dog had already chosen. Rin lowered himself beside Ethan and placed his muzzle against Ethan's glove, whining so softly it seemed to come from the floorboards. Jessica pressed her radio again, this time from the open doorway where the signal caught. "Officer down. Medical now. Suspect fleeing west toward the mill road, still restrained, carrying a metal bracket." Her voice did not break. Her hands almost did, but her voice did not. Snow fell harder outside, bright against the dark pines. Through the rear exit, Caleb's tracks cut toward the old timber passage that led to the abandoned maple mill, where he likely had help, or at least a hidden way out. The ambulance came with its lights flashing through the white afternoon. Deputy Garner arrived close behind, breathless, face pale beneath his weather, reddened skin. The safe remained unopened. Caleb was gone. Ethan was lifted carefully onto a stretcher, his eyes closed, his body too still for a man who had seemed carved from quiet strength only an hour earlier. Jessica walked beside him until the medics told her to step back. Rin tried to follow the stretcher, then returned to the place where Ethan's glove had fallen. When the ambulance pulled away, Jessica stood between two trails, Caleb's footprints vanishing into the snowy woods, and the wet mark on the floor where Ethan had been. Rin picked up the glove in his mouth, held it gently, and looked at her. From that moment on, the case was no longer only in files, invoices, statements, and burn patterns. It had entered the living world. It had a heartbeat fighting somewhere down the road, and a young dog who refused to leave the last warm thing his partner had touched. Ethan Cole did not wake that night, or the next morning. The mountain hospital sat above Larkspur Hollow, like a white box placed carefully among dark pines, its windows glowing through the thin snowfall with the lonely patience of a lighthouse. Jessica Ward stood outside his room just after dawn, one hand resting on Rin's sable head, listening to the slow rhythm of machines beyond the glass. Ethan was listed as critical but stable, a phrase that sounded merciful until a person had to live inside it. His face looked younger without the watchful tension he carried in the field, the sharpness softened by sleep he had not chosen. A nurse named Caroline Myers, a sturdy woman in her late 50s with warm brown skin, silver threaded hair pinned under a blue cap, and the calm voice of someone who had guided many frightened families through long nights, told Jessica, "He is fighting, quietly. But he is fighting." Jessica nodded because words were suddenly heavy things, and she did not trust herself to carry many. Rin changed after the storage room. He still worked. He still followed commands. But something in the young German shepherd had become quieter, as if the world had taught him a lesson too large for 2 years of life. Each time Jessica took him to the hospital, he stopped before Ethan's door and waited. He did not scratch. He did not whine loudly. He simply stood there, ears lowered, amber-brown eyes fixed on the man who had turned his head for half a heartbeat because he thought Rin might be in danger. Jessica understood the terrible math of it. Ethan had looked toward them, and Caleb Rusk had used that kindness like a hidden blade. She could tell herself the truth 100 times. Caleb had been identified. Ethan had needed immediate help. Backup was coming. The right choice had been to stay. But guilt did not always care whether a choice was right. Sometimes it sat beside the truth and refused to move. By noon, Jessica was back at town hall because the case could not be allowed to bleed time. The safe from Drew Larkin's storage room had been secured and transferred for processing. Caleb was gone, but not cleanly gone. He had left tracks, camera images, the broken anchor bracket, and the kind of fear that makes accomplices move too quickly. Jessica spread the new reports across the oak table where Ethan's chair now sat empty. She placed his gray knit cap on the back of it without thinking. Rin noticed. The dog walked to the chair, touched the cap with his nose, then returned beneath Jessica's side of the table. The room felt different without Ethan's dry comments from the wall. It felt less guarded, less balanced. Jessica hated that, then used it. Hurt could either make a person careless or make every detail shine. The first layer was phone data, and Jessica handled it carefully. Cell tower records were not magic. They did not put Marlo Bennett inside his burning house with one glowing arrow. But they did something powerful enough. They broke the story he had sworn to. Marlo had said he was in Montpelier when the fire started. Clara Voss had sworn she heard road noise from that direction during their 6:05 call. Nolan Pike had claimed he remained at his office until after the first emergency alert. Yet all 3 phones had connected with towers near Larkspur Hollow inside the window. They had placed themselves far away from. Not inside the house, not standing over the hallway, but close enough to wound the alibi. And once a sworn statement began to bleed, Jessica knew where to press. The printer in the corner suddenly jerked to life, spitting out one photograph with a harsh mechanical whine that sliced through the quiet room. Rin lifted his head. Jessica froze with her hand above Ethan's empty chair. The image slid into the tray face down, and for one breath, no one moved. When Jessica turned it over, headlights gleamed on wet pavement outside a gas station, and a pale wagon shaped very much like Clara Voss's car passed beneath the camera 12 minutes before the fire call. The photograph did not convict Clara. Jessica would not let it do more than it could. It showed a similar vehicle near the lake road. Not her face, not her hands, not her intent, but together with the phone data and the timing of the call, it made Clara's certainty look less like memory and more like rehearsal. Deputy Miles Garner leaned over the table, his sandy mustache damp from the snow outside, and whispered, "That road does not lead to Montpelier." Jessica replied, "No. It leads to a question she did not expect us to ask." The second layer was uglier because it wore velvet gloves. The property list. Marlo's claim described a house stuffed with valuable things, as if every room had been asked to become a museum after it had already become ash. Jessica worked with Evelyn Hart and an insurance inventory specialist named Paul Sutter. A lean, balding man in his early 60s with wire-frame glasses, a narrow nose, and the dry temperament of someone who trusted measurements more than memories. Paul had spent 30 years reviewing household losses, and he had a way of looking at a room diagram as if it were confessing in inches. 7 antique armchairs in this living room, he said, tapping the floor plan. Only if 4 of them were sitting on each other's laps, Jessica almost smiled. Ethan would have liked him. The metal clocks were worse. Marlo had listed 3 heavy, solid metal mantel clocks from the late 19th century. But in the area where he claimed they had stood, ATF found no matching residue, no warped remains, no fragments consistent with that kind of material. The crystal collection told the same quiet story. A house fire could ruin crystal, blacken it, crack it, scatter it, but it did not make a large set vanish like morning fog. The rugs had invoice numbers from a store that had closed 2 years earlier. One painting receipt used a font from a modern template, though the seller's letterhead claimed to be an old family gallery. Each document was small together. They began to sound like a choir of paper birds flapping in the wrong direction. Then came the temporary housing claim. Marlo had requested living expense coverage for a rental cottage on Maple Road. The lease was signed, dated, notarized, and perfect in the way false things often tried to be perfect. Hazel Whitcomb called back gently and offered tea before questions, adjusted her blue knit cap and looked at the address, her soft face folded with confusion. "That is no cottage, dear. That is the old feed shed behind the Abbott field. Roof has been sagging since my husband still had black hair." She looked embarrassed, as if the lie belonged to her because she had recognized it. Jessica told her it did not. In the evidence bay behind Town Hall, Ryn gave them the next doorway. Among the items collected from Drew Larkin's storage room was a pair of old work boots, stiff with dried mud, and smelling faintly of oil, metal, and cold earth. Ryn approached the row of sealed items calmly, then stopped at the boots. He did not bark. He sat, straight-backed, looking from the boots to Jessica with that grave young face that had first caught the truth beside Morning Glass Lake. The boots went to the lab. By evening, Dana Ruiz called with a cautious result. A chemical trace on the sole was consistent with samples recovered from the Bennett hallway. Consistent, not final. Enough to matter, enough to ask why Drew Larkin's boots carried a whisper from a place he claimed not to have entered. Jessica returned to the interview room after sunset. Nolan Pike sat across from her, smooth as polished stone, his narrow gray mustache trimmed, his suit perfect, his leather case absent this time. He noticed Ethan's empty chair and the knit cap on it. For 1 second, his gaze rested there too long. Jessica did not miss it. She opened a folder, not the one he expected, and said, "Mr. Pike, when people exaggerate losses after a fire, where do they usually make their first mistake?" Nolan blinked once. "I would not speculate on criminal behavior." "Not criminal behavior?" Jessica said. "Documentation behavior." His answer came too quickly. "Volume?" "Usually, they claim more property than the residence could reasonably contain, or they submit invoices that do not match vendor records." The room went still. He had answered like a teacher before remembering he was supposed to be a bystander. Ryn rose under the table, walked to Ethan's empty chair, touched the knit cap again, and came back to Jessica. It felt like a reminder. Keep going. Keep the thread alive. Jessica placed the false rental lease, the tower report, the missing clock findings, and the lab note about Drew's boots in a slow line across the table. Nolan's face did not break, but something behind it stepped backward. The final photograph arrived near 9 that night from a gas station west of town. Caleb Rusk stood beneath the harsh canopy lights, one arm hidden under his jacket, buying medical tape and pain tablets. He had not left Vermont. He had not even gone far behind him. Half hidden near the air pump sat an old green pickup with a dented front fender and a furnace company sticker faded on the door. Jessica enlarged the image until the sticker sharpened enough to read, "Larkin Heating and Repair." Ryn stood so fast his chair leg scraped the floor. His ears came forward, his eyes fixed on the screen as if the photograph had given off a scent no human nose could hold. Jessica looked at Drew's truck, then at Ethan's empty chair, then at the town map spread open beneath her hands. Caleb was not running away from Larkspur Hollow. He was circling back toward it, and somewhere in that circle, another door was about to open. By sunrise, Jessica Ward had stopped looking at the case as a single line and began seeing it as a wheel. Each person was not the whole crime, only a spoke, and the wheel had rolled quietly through Larkspur Hollow for longer than anyone wanted to admit. On the board at Town Hall, she placed their names in a circle. Marlowe Bennett, the grieving homeowner with a claim too large for his little lake house. Clara Voss, the sister who lent him an alibi with trembling hands and a silk scarf pulled too tight. Nolan Pike, the polished adjuster who knew exactly how a loss form should sing. Caleb Rusk, the man who entered rooms after dark and made evidence disappear. And Drew Larkin, the furnace repairman everyone trusted, the man with rough hands, a soft voice, and the keys to half the basements in town. Jessica stood before the board with Ryn at her side. The young German shepherd had slept badly, if dogs slept badly the way people did. He had dozed with his head on Ethan's gray knit cap, waking at every footstep in the hall, his sable ears lifting as though hope itself might come through the door. Ethan still had not fully woken. The hospital called him stable, but Jessica had learned that stable could feel like standing on a frozen lake in spring. It held until it did not. Still, the case had to move, because Caleb Rusk had not run away from Larkspur Hollow. He had circled back toward it. And that meant there was something left to collect, destroy, or silence. Deputy Miles Garner came in with another map, his weathered face lined deeper than usual. "The old green pickup belongs to Drew," he said, setting the photo beside the gas station image. "No surprise there. Half the town has seen it parked outside his shop since before my oldest boy could ride a bike." He paused, uncomfortable with the next sentence before it left his mouth. "People here trust Drew. He fixed my mother's heater twice, and only charged for parts." Jessica looked at the map, then at Drew's name. That was the trouble with trusted men. They could walk into homes without raising a single curtain of suspicion. Drew Larkin's history was everywhere. Once Jessica knew where to look. He had inspected the Bennett furnace. He had serviced 2 homes involved in older claims. He had recommended Nolan Pike to at least one homeowner after a winter pipe issue turned into a larger insurance matter. He knew which houses had weak wiring, which elderly owners kept poor records, which families were desperate enough to listen, and which basements had old oil stains that could muddy an investigation. Nolan turned ashes into paperwork. Drew chose where the ashes would begin. Caleb carried tools, removed records, and frightened people when gentler pressure failed. Marlowe had been a paying customer with greed in his pockets. Clara had held the door open for a lie because she wanted her share and feared being left out of her brother's rescue money. The new lead pointed to the abandoned maple mill west of town. A long, sagging building beyond the pines where sap lines once ran like black veins through the trees. Jessica did not rush there alone. This time, there would be no narrow room, no single partner watching a restrained man, no old anchor ring hidden behind rotting wood. ATF local deputies and 2 federal agents from Burlington formed a quiet perimeter before dawn. One of the agents was Tara Nguyen, a compact woman in her mid-30s with straight black hair cut just below her jaw, sharp dark eyes, and the controlled patience of someone who had grown up in a noisy family and learned to hear the one voice that mattered. She handled digital warrants and phone extractions, and she spoke softly enough that people leaned in before realizing she had taken charge. With her was Special Agent Marcus Bell, early 40s, tall, broad, dark-skinned, clean-shaven, with a calm smile and a preacher's son's habit of making tense rooms feel less likely to break. He had spent years on financial crime, and he looked at bank transfers the way Rin looked at scent trails. From inside the maple mill came a sudden metallic clatter, loud as a church bell dropped in the dark. Every flashlight froze. Snow dust slid from the roof in a soft white curtain. Rin went still, one front paw lifted, his eyes fixed on the side entrance, where the old boards trembled once, then settled. No one moved until Jessica gave the signal. Rin led them to the side entrance, not pulling, only guiding with that quiet certainty that had first stopped him in the Bennett hallway. Inside, the mill smelled of old sugar, wet wood, mice, and cold machinery. Beneath a loose floor panel, agents found a waterproof document case wrapped in black plastic. Inside were copies of claim templates, photographs of rooms before fires, burner phones, a ledger with initials, and several printed leases for temporary housing. Some leases used real streets, but false buildings. One listed Hazel Whitcomb's old feed shed as a cottage with lake views. Jessica looked at that line longer than the others. There was a special cruelty in using a kind woman's neighborhood as scenery for a false home. Caleb was not in the mill, but he had been there recently. Rin found the trace near a rear workbench, then followed it toward a service road leading back toward town. Tara extracted early data from one burner phone and found messages sent after Ethan was injured. One read, "He saw the mark." Another read, "Hospital before he wakes." Jessica felt the room narrow around those words. Caleb was not coming back for money. He was coming back for Ethan. They set the hospital quietly. No sirens, no panic. Caroline Myers, the steady nurse with silver, threaded hair, and a voice warm enough to calm a winter room, moved Ethan to a more secure hallway under the explanation of equipment checks. Deputy Garner stationed 2 officers near the public entrance. Marcus Bell took the stairwell. Tara watched the cameras. Jessica stayed near Ethan's door with Rin. The dog stood close to her leg, every muscle awake. He knew the scent now, not as an idea but as a promise. Caleb, cold metal, wet canvas, pain medicine, fear kept under control. The confrontation, when it came, was smaller than stories usually pretend. Caleb did not burst in like a storm. He came through the side corridor wearing a janitor's gray jacket and a knit cap low over his brow, one wrist wrapped beneath his sleeve. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed hospitals were too kind to be suspicious. Rin noticed before any camera called it in. The dog's body lowered. His ears went forward. A low sound rose from him, not loud, not wild, simply final. Caleb stopped at the end of the hall. Jessica stepped into view. "Do not take another step," she said. For a second, his pale eyes moved past her to Ethan's door, then to Rin, then to the exit behind him, where Marcus Bell had appeared. Tara's voice came over Jessica's earpiece, calm and clear. "We have him on 3 cameras." Caleb's shoulders sank by a fraction. He was tired, cornered, still dangerous but no longer invisible. Rin stood between Caleb and Ethan's door. He did not lunge. He did not need to. His sable body was tense, young, loyal, and certain, a living line drawn across the white hospital floor. Caleb looked at the dog as if seeing, at last, the one witness he had never known how to frighten. After Caleb was secured and taken away, the hallway did not feel victorious. It felt emptied. Jessica returned to Ethan's room with Rin walking close beside her. Outside the window, the first pale light of morning touched the pine. Ethan lay still, the gray cap folded beside his pillow. Rin rose gently on his front paws and placed his muzzle against Ethan's hand as he had done every night since the storage room. Jessica started to tell him softly that it was time to let the nurse work. Then Ethan's finger moved. It was barely anything. A small bend, a quiet answer from somewhere far away. But Rin did not miss it. His head lifted. His ears stood straight. His eyes brightened with such sudden hope that Jessica felt her own breath catch. In that little room above Larkspur Hollow, after lies, ashes, ledgers, and long corridors of fear, the youngest member of the team heard spring before anyone else did. Ethan Cole woke the way spring came to Vermont. Slowly, quietly, and after everyone had almost stopped trusting the calendar. The first sign was not dramatic. No great speech, no sudden rising from the bed, no miracle wrapped in music. It was only his eyelids trembling beneath the pale morning light. Then his fingers moving again against the blanket where Rin's muzzle had rested through the night. Jessica Ward was sitting beside him with a paper cup of hospital coffee cooling in her hands. She had not meant to stay awake, but guilt and hope had taken turns keeping watch. Rin lay beneath the chair, his sable body curled tight, ears twitching at every sound in the hall. The young German shepherd had become thinner in spirit over the past few days, not from weakness but from waiting too hard. When Ethan's breathing changed, Rin lifted his head before Jessica did. Ethan opened his eyes. They were unfocused at first, dark and tired, searching the ceiling as if he had come back from a long road and did not yet know the name of the town. Jessica leaned forward, careful not to crowd him. Ethan swallowed, tried to speak, then managed in a rough whisper, "Caleb." Jessica felt something in her chest loosen. Caught. His gaze shifted, slow and heavy, toward Rin. The dog had risen and placed both front paws gently on the edge of the bed, not jumping, not shaking the mattress, just asking permission with his whole body. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "Who held the door?" Jessica's mouth almost smiled before her heart knew how. "Youngest member of the team." Ethan breathed out, the faintest shadow of humor passing across his face. "I knew he would not like being outsmarted." Rin gave one soft huff, which in another life might have been a legal objection. Caroline Myers, the steady nurse with silver, threaded hair and a voice like warm tea, looked in from the doorway and pressed one hand to her chest. She did not interrupt. Some recoveries needed witnesses more than words. Jessica had imagined this moment 100 times and had never imagined how small it would be. Ethan was alive. He was awake, but he was not restored by magic. His voice came slowly. His eyes tired quickly. Pain pulled at the edges of his expression, though he tried to hide it in the old military way, as if discomfort were a bill he could pay later. Jessica saw it and did not let him pretend too much. "You scared us," she said. "Did not mean to. That is usually how it works." His gaze returned to her, clearer now. "You stayed." Jessica understood what he meant. She looked down at her hands. "I chose you over the chase. You chose right." The words were quiet, but they landed with more force than all the reports she had filed that week. Jessica had carried that choice like a stone beneath her ribs. Caleb had escaped because she had stayed. Ethan had lived because she had stayed. Both things were true, and truth could be a hard guest at the table. Ethan seemed to read the shape of it on her face. "If it had been you on the floor," he said, pausing to gather breath, "I would have done the same." The heart monitor gave one sudden bright beep, sharper than the others, and Rin's ears shot up as sunlight flashed across the metal rail of the bed. For half a second, Jessica froze, caught between fear and prayer. Then Ethan turned his head toward the dog and whispered, "Easy, Judge, I am still here." Rin lowered his ears, leaned closer, and the room seemed to exhale with him. Later that morning, when the doctor allowed only a short conversation, Ethan gave them the last piece without trying to become the hero of the whole case. He remembered the safe in Drew Larkin's storage room. He remembered the black notebook inside it, seen only for a moment through the drilled gap before everything went wrong. On the corner of one page, above a list of initials, he had seen the mark DLN4. Jessica already had enough to pressure Drew and Nolan from different sides. The boots, the false claim templates, the phone records, the forged leases, the gas station image, and Caleb's attempt to reach the hospital. But Ethan's memory connected the two men across 4 earlier files. DL for Drew Larkin, N for Nolan Pike. 4 claims that had not been accidents of paperwork, but a pattern. Jessica did not make Ethan carry the case from his hospital bed. She only wrote the mark down, thanked him, and watched his eyes close from exhaustion. Rin stayed still until Ethan slept again. Then the dog followed Jessica back into the corridor, where Tara Nguyen and Marcus Bell waited with fresh updates from the burner phones and the mill documents. Tara, compact and sharp, eyed, had extracted message threads tying Caleb to both Drew and Nolan. Marcus, calm as a Sunday hymn, had traced payments that moved through small accounts, then circled back as consulting fees. Together with ATF's findings, the case finally had its full shape. The charges came not from one shining clue but from many patient ones. Fire pattern analysis showed more than one starting point and a trace of unusual compounds in the hallway. Phone data did not place every person at the exact spot, but it broke the sworn claim that they had all been far away. The insurance upgrade had happened too close to the fire to ignore. Marlowe Bennett's property list collapsed under its own weight. Metal clocks without matching remains, crystal pieces without proper fragments, chairs that could not fit in the room where they were supposedly kept, invoices from closed shops, and a piano with no mark on the floor. The temporary housing lease pointed to a place that was not a cottage at all, only an old shed with a tired roof. Drew's boots carried a trace that belonged near the burned hallway. Nolan's documents carried the same mistakes across too many files. Caleb's safe, phones, and return to the hospital turned suspicion into structure. No one in the circle was painted as a monster from a children's tale. That would have been too easy, and easier stories are not always honest. Marlowe had debts hidden under polished shoes and church donations. Clara feared being left with nothing, as she believed she had been all her life. Nolan loved being the man who knew the rules well enough to bend them. Caleb was a paid hand who had mistaken coldness for strength. Drew was the saddest betrayal of all, the trusted repairman, the man who carried tools into widows' kitchens, who knew which homes were tired, which owners were lonely, and which small failures could be dressed up as fate. Reasons were gathered. Responsibility remained. When the first hearing was set and the town finally began to breathe again, Larkspur Hollow did not celebrate loudly. It was not that kind of place. People brought casseroles to the church basement, spoke in low voices, and looked at one another with the shy sadness of neighbors who had learned trust could be used against them. Hazel Whitcomb came with a blueberry pie and a blue knit cap pulled over her white hair. She told Jessica, "I suppose I should be angry." Then she looked toward the window, where Morning Glass Lake shone between the trees. Mostly I am tired, but tired can still bake. A town meeting was held in the white church with the green door. The pews filled slowly. Firefighters, nurses, farmers, shop owners, old men in seed caps, women with folded hands, children too young to understand why the adults were quieter than usual. They did not promise to build a grand center overnight. They did something more believable. They voted to create the Larkspur Fire Recovery Fund, a small fund to help families facing fire loss, insurance confusion, or dishonest claims made in their names. The burned lake property would not be rebuilt immediately. For now, a simple wooden sign would stand there. Hand-lettered by a retired schoolteacher, future home of the Larkspur Fire Recovery Fund. A week later, Ethan was well enough to sit outside in a wheelchair under a thin blue sky. Jessica pushed him into the hospital courtyard, where the snow had pulled back from the edges of the grass, and the first green blades looked almost brave. Rin trotted ahead, circled once, then came back quickly, as if joy was allowed only if everyone remained in sight. Ethan watched him with one eyebrow raised. "He is still a puppy." Jessica folded her arms. "Yes, just a puppy with a better work record than several adults." Ethan looked at Rin. Rin looked back, serious as a magistrate. "That tracks," Ethan said. For the first time in days, Jessica laughed. It was not loud, it was not free of grief or fatigue, but it was real, and that mattered. After Ash, after false statements, after the long white hallway of waiting, even a small laugh could feel like a match used properly, not to destroy, but to warm. The final visit came at Morning Glass Lake. Ethan was still weak, wrapped in a dark coat, one hand resting on the wheelchair arm. Jessica stood beside him, her chestnut hair lifting slightly in the cold breeze. Rin sat between them, young and proud, his sable coat bright in the northern sun. Across the road, Marlowe Bennett's damaged house had not been rebuilt. The porch was gone. The windows were covered. But near the driveway stood the new wooden sign, plain and hopeful, facing the water. The lake held the sky the way it had on the first morning, but now Jessica saw it differently. Not as a mirror for what had been lost, but as a place wide enough to hold what came after. Ethan was alive, though not yet whole. Jessica was tired, though not broken. Rin was still young, though the case had given him older eyes. Nothing had returned to the way it was before. Maybe that was the mercy nobody asked for, but everyone needed. Sometimes the most beautiful ending was not restoration. Sometimes it was three living souls standing together beside the ruins, learning that when the old shape of life was gone, loyalty could become the first beam of the new one. At the end of this story, we are reminded that truth may be delayed, but it is never truly lost. It can survive beneath ashes, inside a quiet witness, in the memory of a wounded friend, or in the loyal heart of a dog who refuses to leave the side of someone in need. Jessica, Ethan, and Rin did not win because they were fearless. They won because they kept choosing what was right when the easy choice was somewhere else. Jessica chose to save a life before chasing revenge. Ethan carried one small piece of truth back from the darkness. Rin, still young, taught everyone that loyalty does not need words to be powerful. In our everyday lives, we may not face burning houses or hidden crimes, but we do face smaller tests of character. We choose whether to tell the truth when a lie would be easier. We choose whether to help someone when no one is watching. We choose whether to protect the weak, respect the elderly, and show kindness to animals who trust us with their whole hearts. Animals are not just companions. Sometimes, they are gentle messengers from heaven. They remind us to be patient, to listen more deeply, and to love without asking for anything in return. A dog cannot explain faith with words, but a loyal dog can show us what faith looks like, staying close, standing guard, and believing someone is worth saving. Maybe that is where the miracle lives, not always in a thunderous sign from above, but in a quiet paw on a hospital blanket, in a second chance after a long night, in a heart that still chooses love after being tired and afraid. God often works through small things: a kind neighbor, a brave friend, a faithful animal, and one honest choice made at the right moment. So let this story remind us to live with more mercy, more courage, and more gratitude. Be gentle with those who are hurting. Be honest even when no one applauds. Care for the animals placed in your life, because they may be carrying more love than we know. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and whether an animal has ever changed your life. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, loyalty, faith, and the quiet miracles that still happen among ordinary people. May God bless you, protect your family, comfort every lonely heart, and watch over every faithful animal that walks beside us.